Hello, and welcome to another episode of Paranormal NL, a place where people can share their paranormal experiences in Newfoundland and Labrador and anywhere else in the world. And talking about anywhere else in the world, today we're going to go to Texas. We have Dr. Judd Burton, and Dr. Judd Burton is a multiple book author and entrepreneur. He also has a PhD in history with a focus on the history of religions, early Christianity, and Greco-Roman religions. He also has a Master of Arts, MA, in Anthropology and History, and a Bachelor of Arts, BA in History. He is the owner, director, and senior fellow for the Institute of Biblical Anthropology and the owner-operator Burton Beyond, and much more. Now, because we're getting so close to Christmas, and we thought we'd do a special Christmas episode. So welcome, Dr. Burton.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks for being on the show. So tell us about your Christmas stuff you got going on at Burton Beyond.
Well, without fail, everybody taps me, or I should say a lot of people tap me for a show around Christmas, because that's one of the things that I've been doing for years. Is people always want to talk about the history of Christmas. They want to talk about the strange supernatural element of Christmas. And we all know that there's this season's kind of magical. There's a magic that's unique all to Christmas. And so I have my own reasons for interest in Christmas and its history and culture, and because it was always a family favorite, as it is in many families. But as my historical training and anthropological training began, I gradually learned more about the different Christmas traditions and the history of Christmas, and because of my particular interests, the biblical groundings and scriptural groundings, early Christian groundings of the holidays. So inevitably, lots of people want to talk about Christmas, and some of my most famous interviews have been on the topic of Christmas. And of course, in the social media world, it's a hotly debated topic, even amongst Christians.
It is. Well, let's get weird. Let's get paranormal Christmas.
Sure. Well, let's just look at just from the biblical perspective. If we look at the sort of Judeo-Christian, or rather Christian groundings for Christmas, it doesn't get more paranormal than God becoming flesh and being born into the world, right? Gotta admit that's a pretty phenomenally paranormal event. And so, right off of the sort of Western groundings for Christmas, there's a high degree of supernaturalism associated with Christmas.
There is, yes. There's a big history behind it. Now, there's also, in a lot of other places in the world, they celebrate Christmas with scary, weird things like Krampus. What is that?
Well, a lot of the traditions that in some cases get grafted into Christmas celebrations, or at the very least lumped in with them, that come from different parts of the world, not just the Western world, but since so much of our traditions in the West come from places like Europe and Western Asia and North Africa, that's usually where I sort of bring the discussion into. But the winter solstice was an important part of the annual festivals of pre-Christian Europe and part of early post-Christian Europe as well. These are the indigenous agrarian festivals, of which the winter solstice and the summer solstice are ones, and the equinoxes were also festivals that celebrated the different changes of the seasons, and typically what those had to do with the agriculture and the pastoralism of those people. So along with those changes, of course, came the pantheons of deities and spirits that these peoples revered. And you mentioned Krampus. Krampus is one of those Germanic Norse traditions, and you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody, especially if you're paying attention to memes on social media, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who hasn't seen a Krampus meme. And Krampus is really he's kind of a scary goat demon, almost a Pan figure looking character, who the way that I typically explain him is he's sort of a twisted version of Santa Claus.
Oh, a very twisted, scary version.
Yeah, insofar as that, yes, he was concerned with who was being naughty or nice, but if you were being naughty, he would come around to the houses in the wintertime around the solstice with his pack. But he wasn't really carrying presents in his pack. He was rounding up the children who had been naughty. So there's an entire. I saw a meme the other day that had this sort of caricatured Krampus, and he had a bag, and he said, "Get in the bag." And I said that pretty much encapsulates what Krampus was. But he represents one of those folkloric spirits that were revered and feared, in fact, around the time of the winter solstice, which was during what the old pagans in Europe called the dark half of the year.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of culture around that. How about other strange goings on with Christmas? I hear you've got something written up for the 12 days of Christmas.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wrote a little ebook called 12 Days of Christmas Bible Studies, and the 12 chapters are basically kind of historical meditations on different aspects of the Christian tradition of Christmas. And so, I look at things like the wise men, the magi, the nativity itself, and the history of the Holy Family, and things like that. I think one of the interesting things, of course, outside of the actual birth of Jesus himself, one of the interesting paranormal things about the entire nativity story is the Star of Bethlehem, and the consensus really amongst scholars now is that this was a conjunction, an astronomical conjunction. Of course, in the ancient world, you can't really separate astronomy from astrology, so there were all of these omens and things that were associated. It was a very auspicious thing, and you've got this group of people from probably Babylon, probably had been there since the days of Daniel the prophet, who was actually one of the wise men, one of the magi during the Neo-Babylonian period. And so these magi, these wise men, these astrologers and scholars would have known about the biblical prophetic texts. They would have known about Daniel and his prophecies. And so they were actually watching, in a way, for this event. And most astronomers think that this was a conjunction that certainly involved Jupiter and Venus, and probably the star Regulus, and it occurred in such a manner that the Magi would have discerned this as an omen of the birth of not just any king, but the greatest king, the King of Kings, and that's in part because of the involvement of planet Jupiter in this conjunction. Jupiter was known, believe it or not, Jupiter was known as Nibiru in the Babylonian language, and so this was Marduk's star, the king's star. So it heralded the arrival of this prophesied Jewish Messiah, and these magi, the wise men, knew all about what to look for and when to look for it. And so you've got these people who are kind of they're kind of like the wizards in Lord of the Rings. They're vested with all of this knowledge, but there's a supernaturalism about them as well. And I've always found that was a really interesting part of the Christmas story. And so there are a couple of chapters in the book that I address that and kind of go into the history of the Magi.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole different spin-off on Planet X, also known as Planet Nibiru or Nibiru, that, there's a lot of information about that that I'm sure a lot of the listeners may already know about. Do you want to talk a little bit about the people who they thought were from Nibiru?
Well, I don't really subscribe to Sitchin's interpretation of the word. Zechariah Sitchin wrote a series of books about a great writer, but he wrote a series of books about what he called the 12th planet, or Nibiru, and he thought that Nibiru was a rogue planet. But if you look at all of the astrological material that we have from the Babylonian world, if you look at the actual Sumerian and Akkadian words, the words or variations of this word Nibiru, they all refer to Marduk's star, and this was the planet Jupiter. And so virtually every occurrence of that word in the Babylonian or the older Akkadian and Sumerian fragments that we have refers to Jupiter and not a rogue planet, as Sitchin had written out. And people can go and look this up for themselves. Oxford has a great Sumerian Akkadian glossary and grammar, and there are a number of other operations around, but it's really just kind of a Google search away, and people can look into that. But I think that it's interesting insofar as that it's kind of a new take on Nibiru. It sort of brings that concept into the conjunction, but it's actually the planet Jupiter, the star that the ancients thought heralded the arrival of kings.
So, when you mentioned Zechariah Sitchin, I thought instantly about, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens from ancient aliens.
Everybody's favorite show on ancient aliens, yeah.
Sorry, George, we're not being mean, but there's a lot of different camps out there.
We love you, George. I'm just in a different camp.
And what's George's last name again? T begins
with Tsoukalos.
Yes, yeah. But I mean, you do get into some different things in the 12 Days of Christmas besides that. I mean, that was a really good story about planet Jupiter, because that is one of the, when you look up at the sky, you think, oh, that's a star. No, that's a planet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are definitely other topics that I cover. One of them is one of the things that happens in the course of the nativity story that most people will be familiar with is the flight to Egypt after King Herod kills off a lot of the firstborn in Bethlehem. That, to me, that's another thing that I kind of wrote about. I think it's really interesting because by that time, Jesus is a toddler, and probably the place that the Holy Family ends up in is Alexandria, Egypt, because there had been a long-standing community of Jews there really since about the 4th century BC. In fact, Alexandria was the place where the Septuagint, the Greek old translation of the Old Testament scriptures, was produced in the 3rd and 2nd centuries. This was also the home of the great Hellenic Jewish philosopher Philo, and it's likely that Philo may have been one of Jesus's early tutors when he was in Alexandria. That's just scholarly conjecture on my part, but there are a lot of similarities you find in Jesus' philosophy and Philo's philosophy. But see, even that is a paranormal event because Joseph was warned in a dream, according to the text, to make this flight to Egypt to escape the depredations of Herod. So there's just so much interesting, supernatural, paranormal stuff in the nativity story itself.
There is definitely a whole lot. Tell us some more.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the Sitchin stuff, and he was really big on interpreting the Anunnaki as these extraterrestrial gods. But I think if you look at these things in the context of the ancient Near East, of the literatures of the ancient Near East, they're talking about giants because giants that certainly had otherworldly pedigree, don't get me wrong, but probably angelic pedigree. And it's now this is all going to make sense here in a minute. I'm not just building a bunch of satellites that don't have an orbit. But what's interesting is that we're probably talking about the Anakim giants.
Before we go on, Dr. Burton, I want you to tell everybody about your specialty in your book, Giants.
Oh, sure. Well, I've written several books, but the main one that I'm known for is Interview with a Giant, and it's kind of a different take on the biblical giants and the giants in the ancient Near East and worldwide, really, because I used anthropological models to study a kind of giant culture. And so that's really kind of the scholarly trajectory that I took in terms of evaluating giants on their historical, archaeological, and even mythological axes of evidence. But what makes it how this all relates to the nativity story is that there was a giant that everybody probably knows. He's probably the most famous giant in the Bible, and that's Goliath. Everybody knows the story of David and Goliath, right? So David was an ancestor of Jesus. His mother his mother Mary in particular had both Levitical ancestry to the priesthood and also Davidic ancestry. So she had both royal and priestly blood. But if you look at going all the way back to David, long before he becomes king, becomes an Israelite champion because he not only fights, but he defeats Goliath. Again, it's probably one of the more famous Bible stories ever. Goliath, really, you could sort of look at this as the last attempt of some of the remaining giants, these Anakim and Rephaim, in the ancient Near East, to try and destroy the bloodline of Jesus, the bloodline of the Messiah, because it was through David. So, again, most people probably don't think about giants being related at all to the Christmas story, but in fact, by proxy, if you look at the genealogy of Jesus, at the very least, you can say that it's related because of this battle between David and Goliath, that took place almost 1,000 years before Jesus was born.
And, in the Bible, they also talk about the Nephilim. Do you want to explain a little bit about what they are?
Certainly. Well, the Nephilim were the original giants. They were the pre-flood and quite possibly some of the earliest post-flood giants. So these later tribes and clans of giants like the Rephaim and the Anakim that we were talking about, and the Zamzumim and the Emim and the Avim were later iterations of those giants. But if you look at early Genesis, particularly Genesis chapter 6, kind of lays out where they came from, and as commentary, these apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jasher and the Book of Jubilees and some of the other Dead Sea Scroll material, they give commentary on that world. And the Book of Enoch is a really interesting read. Anybody can look it up. It's public domain. The R.H. Charles translation is a really good one. And what it does is it tells us all about that pre-flood world, the world, leading up to the great deluge that so many world cultures talk about. And it talks about these rebellious fallen divine beings coming down, these rebellious angels, and mating with human females, and they exchange a kind of mixture of practical sciences and occult sciences for that exchange. And the result of these unions were these giants, the Nephilim. And they become the basis for all later generations of giants that were prolific early on and became less so that by the time of the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, there's a kind of scattering of these giants all over the globe.
I hear some people say that, the Nephilim were like wraiths or even Bigfoot.
Yeah, that's an interesting proposition. I've heard in even within the last year or two, people talking about the possibility that Bigfoot or Sasquatch are remnant populations of these giants. I could see that. I could see them going, kind of feral. Clearly, what we know about Sasquatch behavior, they're clearly extremely intelligent. So I have no problem with that being the case. I used to be a pure naturalist when it came to Bigfoot. In other words, this was just another hominid species that was just remnant and very elusive. But there are so many weird occurrences that occur with Bigfoot sightings, like orbs and portals and UFO sightings and things of that nature, that it seems like there's something more than just the natural going on there.
And also, camouflage seems to be something a lot of people talk about. They think that he can camouflage kind of like an octopus would.
Well, that's certainly a possibility. I mean, there's just, when it comes to the Sasquatch, I don't understand why the academic community is so staunchly against it. I remember one time I heard a lecture from Jane Goodall, and somebody had asked her about if she believed in Sasquatch or the possibility of Sasquatch. And she's noted primatologist and anthropologist, and her answer was basically that there's no reason that creature can exist. She said she believed in the possibility.
Well, tell us about some of the bones that you actually had in your hands and saw. Because, a lot of people say, okay, where's the proof? Where's the beef, right? Well, where's all the bones? Where'd they go?
Right. Well, I've got some theories about that. One of my good friends and colleagues, the late Joe Taylor, who was a consummate field man, we had done work on several projects, and he had done work in Peru. But he had actually molded some of these bones. He had the mold of a 3-foot femur, which makes that's a tall dude. That makes that guy about 12 feet tall.
But in medical terms, there are some giants well known throughout medical history that had a problem with their pituitary gland.
Yes, that's acromegaly, right?
Yes, and we're actually coming up almost on coffee hour, Dr. Burton. And I know you've been sipping on some coffee. I can hear something in the background. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Kevlar coffee?
Yeah, I've partnered with this really great company, Kevlar Joe, and I've got 2 coffees. If people are coffee lovers like me, I've got a Colombian and an espresso. So that's Burton Beyond Colombian and Cafe Professo espresso. So if you like your strong coffee and your lattes and your cappuccinos, then I would highly recommend this stuff. I wouldn't endorse it if it wasn't great coffee, and people can go to my website and find out about that and order it if they like.
And Dr. Burton definitely knows about coffee.
I do, yes.
Lots of dissertations and writing with coffee. Now, we still have a couple of minutes, and what I was going to do was, you mentioned already Kevlar Joe, but there's so many different places where you can reach out to and find Dr. Burton on. We had mentioned Burton Beyond, and that's burtonbeyond.net. And where else can people look for you and your books?
Well, yes, I've got a number of books. The other website is right now the Institute website is part of Burton Beyond. But I also have a drjuddburton.com website, which is potentially going to become the Institute site and all on its own in the future. But if people are interested, I've got a number of books that I've written. Interview with the Giant that I mentioned already, the Nephilim dossier, which is a kind of follow-up to that. The Shepherd Sling, which is a kind of simple introduction to giants, and then I've got a book called The Paranormal Big Country, which is about the folklore of my part of West Texas. So there's a lot more, and I've got a ton of stuff for free that people can watch on YouTube. You can follow me on social media. There are T-shirts and coffee mugs and all kinds of things that are coming down the pike, but I've got so many irons in the fire right now. I'm finishing writing 2 books with some colleagues of mine right now that people can keep a lookout for. Man, this next year, 2024, is going to be a really prominent year for all things Burton Beyond and the Institute of Biblical Anthropology. Oh, and I'll squeeze this in real quick. I also offer classwork on all of these topics.
I was going to reach out there and say, I was going to mention you've got biblical anthropology, biblical demonology. There's a whole bunch of stuff: mythology, ancient Near East civilization, Mediterranean civilization, and the preternatural morphology. Now, I wanted to do a second episode with you and follow up on the Institute of Biblical Anthropology with that episode, and that'll be coming on now in a few minutes. And make sure you listen to part 2 with Dr. Judd Burton. And if y'all want to get on Paranormal NL, reach out to us on Paranormal NL on Facebook. Messenger, and head on over there and let us know if you want to be on a podcast with Paranormal NL so you can be heard all over the world. And don't forget to click the bell so you can follow along on Spotify and get notified when the new videos appear. Stay spooky, my friends. Stay tuned for episode 2 with Dr. Judd Burton.